Hello, je suis la Bratishenko, conservateur public de CCF, and I'm happy to welcome you to the end of the beginning of the student visa review. With me, some fantastic guests that I would like to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to call on people in the order that they appear. Okay, Menna, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, hello everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me for this very important topic that touches on an issue that I had to go through, not as a student, but as a teacher on a visa. But it's the issue of that visa. I am Menna Agha. I am an architect and a researcher. I come from Egypt. I'm a third generation displaced Nubian. I have been in the US as a spatial justice fellow at the University of Oregon. That's when I was on that J1 dreaded visa. And I'm currently running a spatial justice agenda for the Flemish Architecture Institute in Belgium. So, and thank you again for the invitation.
Hi, my name is Jess Myers. I'm an assistant professor at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island. I am helping to moderate this afternoon and just really happy to be helping to host this conversation. Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. My name is Ashraf Salama. I'm originally from Egypt. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow. Most of my work over the past 30 years, has been focusing on design pedagogy and issues related to the global South. I have been in Scotland for 7 years, and I can relate really to the concept of the project and the idea of the project and the experience of the students. So thank you very much to Jess and Lev for having me as part of this discussion.
Thank you. And Dan.
Hi, my name is Dan Taeyoung. I am a 1.5 generation Korean American, lived between Korea and the US, and I teach at Columbia. Most of my thinking is around experimental design tools and cooperative spaces, and how our relationships between ourselves can both shape our communal environments and also our physical spaces. And so it's kind of the interplay between our social norms and our spaces. It's kind of what I'm both researching and practicing. And yeah, I'm excited to be part of this conversation as both one of the 3 people who helped create the exhibition website, in addition to Lucy Xiao Liu and Shay Fitzpatrick. And yeah, I'm really excited. So thank you to Jess and Lev for the invitation to talk together.
Thank you, Dan. Over to you, Jess.
Yeah, just to talk a little bit about the project, it's called the Student Visa Review, and it came together as an exhibition or as a concept really at the beginning of the school year in the last fall, when ICE in the United States was beginning to sort of use its leverages, its oversight over student visas in the United States to kind of hold international students hostage, as Menna helpfully framed, to pressure universities to remain open during the pandemic, essentially saying that online school was illegitimate for visa access, and if schools were offering their courses in a COVID-safe way, that students would sort of lose their privileges. There was a lot of back and forth scuffle about what this policy would look like that left international students, my students, in a kind of limbo, not really understanding whether they would be able to be on campus or not, and also in their own homes as the pandemic was increasing in seriousness and intensity, that feeling that discomfort at not being with their families too in such a disconnected and really uncertain time. So essentially what we did is I reached out to Lev as to whether he would be interested in kind of co-creating a digital exhibition space around this question of international student experiences. And we came up with this concept of bureau chiefs, essentially asking students who were studying abroad from home, so studying remotely at RISD, but in their home countries, to document their experiences and send us an audio report every month, where they would either be tracking their own experiences or interviewing other students in their area, interviewing their networks about the experience of having them home. The online, this online exhibition space with Surplus Plus, Dan, collective that Dan is very much active in, to have this sort of interactive space where you could listen through the students' experiences over the course of the year. So we kept track of their reports from October through February. And it was extremely helpful to me to hear what students were experiencing in terms of how they were creating community with themselves, or how they were experiencing for the first time being able to study, but also have their network at home around them, which for many people was a huge novelty. So while we're closing the exhibition today, we wanted to have a conversation with international educators, with educators who have been reflecting on this relationship between international students and American universities or universities in the West. So I'm extremely excited to hear what our panelists have their thoughts for us about the exhibition and what students were reporting about their experiences. Yeah.
So I think the first question is what did you think going through the site and listening to these stories and listening to these interviews? I don't know, Menna or Ashraf, you want to begin?
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. I think the entire project really invites us to reflect on a number of points, and some of the student diaries are really important in the sense of showing us how their identities are shaped outside of the campus environment. Typically, students' identities are shaped within the campus environment, within the physical campus. Now, students have this kind of, or experiencing this kind of duality between engaging with the outside world through online platforms, and at the same time, speaking the language of home, being at the comfort of home, and all of this. So that's an important dimension about shaping their identities. And I can see that in Albina, for example. Albina is talking about her experience. She was born in the US and then went back, raised in Ghana, want to come back to the US to study. And then her exposure to the global experience, her meeting of new people, learning in a new environment. She didn't hear any discussion before about race issues, for example, and then she had to experience that. Then going back home, shape a different form of experience. And I think this dynamic is really very important in the context of the pandemic. We can see also other students, I wouldn't call it struggle, but probably challenges. One of the students is talking, Mackenzie, for example, is talking about the difficulty of being with her boyfriend, and they have this kind of discussion. He's studying somewhere in the world, she's studying somewhere else, and how these shape the identity of the students. In a normal campus environment, students used to go out, have coffee, have fun, come back to the university. All of these experiences are different. Kevin, and having to go through the idea or the year out, that's also another experience, because he was not planning for it, but having to go to a year out and misses that idea of peer learning. So there are challenges really that we can see in the student diaries, and these are just a couple of examples, and probably other panelists would have other views.
Yes, I completely agree. And I have to say, when Jess sent me this digital exhibition and I was looking at all these narratives, I was not the least surprised. I know exactly what it means to be on a visa. I've been on a visa for the past 10 years. I haven't lived in my country, and I haven't had a stable visa for the past 10 years. So this kind of precarity is something that I recognize a lot, but it had reminded me of something that I believe in, which is that we don't do a great job as students of space in understanding the space in which we create space, or in which we learn how to make a space. And we don't really give it a lot of attention and take a critical distance from it. Because if you look at a studio and I look at my students, I know that an American student, a German student, and a Nigerian student do not have the same standing. They don't exist in the same space. They might exist between the same walls, but they don't exist under the same space. The colors of their passports, the fact that they are on a visa makes it that this is a completely different space for each and every one of them. And the other issue is that the fact that they have to be quote unquote displaced from that studio, from that box that we sit in and draw, counts as a form of displacement. Shows all displacement from resources, displacement from examples of what is considered good architecture or case studies and all these things that we teach. Shows you also that we have deprived the spaces from which they come the right to be worthy of study, the right to be worthy of reconsideration as architecture. So this project has, again, and I was not surprised, and I was thinking, yeah, but sure, that's what happens to us, and we're always in these precarious situations. If you are on a J1 or an F1 visa, and you are you're in Oregon, for example, and in which, in a city where everybody is smoking weed, you know that you can't do that because you lie under federal law in which smoking weed is not legal. So you can do it, or you can do it and talk about it or tell everybody about it, because your visa can be revoked for doing something that is legal for everybody else around you. So the space and the power structure and the legal construction, everything that kind of nestles you in these four walls are completely different from your neighbor in the next desk who comes from another state, or the neighbor next to that desk who comes from an EU country, who can basically renew their visa online while you have to schedule your visit to the consulate or to the offices to renew the visa, and you have this 2 months of anxiety before, 3 weeks of anxiety after, to make sure that your visa comes in. So the space in it's different. But I think it's just looking at how nuanced the perspectives were. And it's not about, it's just so bad that we're not there, and there is a different way there are all these different perspectives looking at the places from which now they are kind of ingesting this new regime of architecture without just we don't see the stereotypical, the student has to be here kind of thing. And I'm not saying we should teach on Zoom. Internet is not a luxury afforded to everybody. So a student who has to, I was in Egypt last week. If we do this in Egypt, my quality of internet would be completely different. So so again, this is, I think, a pause to think about the space in which we make space. And I will, I look forward to hearing my colleagues' opinion.
Yeah, I really appreciate and agree with what has been said so far in the space in which we make space. And one thing that has struck me listening to the recordings and also talking to some of my students are some of the silver linings that I think of Zoom learning, which again, which I also do not, think is necessarily the greatest format, or at least we need more kind of learnings about how to do it properly. But I had a lot of students say, there's a silver lining in which I didn't have to experience certain aggressions in the studio, or actually was be able to be near family. and heard some students like, I believe like Mackenzie, others talking about how really actually nice it was to be at home. And to me, I think what's really interesting about this is that whatever the kind of hidden or more complex social relationships between students in physical space exist have been kind of excised or flattened through this medium. And as a result, Zoom has revealed, it similarly makes everyone's experience similarly difficult. And I was surprised the extent in which these aspects of communication were really shared. Maybe a specific example is like, I believe Mackenzie, one of the students, talked about that it was really nice to be at home, that her parents suddenly started understanding the degree in which she was busy, that kind of the workload was able to be shared. And the difficulty of Zoom learning and the things that it removes of what it's possible, you know, the kind of common casual conversations between people, between students and teachers, all of that is removed similarly. And I feel like it's worth, as we collectively transition towards maybe back towards a hybrid model of learning, I think it's really important to almost use the last year as a little bit of a lens through which we can examine how those, like what has been removed, what has been less possible through Zoom learning. And as a result, if those things being less possible has resulted in a more safe or more supportive environment, what does it mean for the students who had been feeling safe and supported before and in person? What are the discrepancies between what systems of tacit knowledge, you know, like multi-generational higher education students already knowing how to navigate the landscape of how to get TA-ships, you know, et cetera. What does it mean for that inequity, and how has this experience effectively given a great filter for us? Who are the students who felt disadvantaged more for Zoom learning versus less? And it might be worthwhile thinking, I've been really thinking about that difference being a helpful lens through which to examine a kind of tacit privilege or cultural privilege that's not very easily communicated because except to those for whom cultural practices of learning don't match the pre-existing cultural practices of learning at our institutions.
Really, the ideas raised by Menna and Dan are complementary in nature. And I would say, for example, Menna is telling us that space is a construct, is not really a physical or social only, it's an idea. So somebody can be sitting in a space physically, but having all kinds of backgrounds in terms of language and in terms of cultural backgrounds and in terms of experiences. And these are missed definitely from the online discussion, which tell us also that the hidden curriculum or the hidden curriculum or the spontaneous social practices that take place in a learning setting are now being redefined, because we have a new hidden curriculum online that determine the relationship between instructors or tutors and students. So probably as we go in this pandemic thing, I think there will be opportunities to redefine that hidden curriculum, try to look at protocols, modes of communication, ethics of engagement online. Also, these subjects are really very new now. But I just want to go back to that idea of, the idea of digital is not new. It has been predicted in the early 90s. If we look at the work of William Mitchell. William Mitchell was the dean of MIT in the 90s, and he generated a number of books, Electronictopia, Me++, and a number of books in which he introduced the notion of digital communities. And many people were working on that in MIT at the time. Now, suddenly, we were not prepared to go through that experience, and we were asked to go through the experience of changing the entire model of architecture education, of engaging with the students in about 2 weeks, to use a different medium to basically break the continuity of a model that existed for 200 years. So I think not only students are struggling, but also staff and academics and those who teach are struggling also with the students, the amount of time you're giving online and all of these. So I think despite the difficulties, there are excellent opportunities to improve a lot of things and a lot of challenges that used to exist even before the pandemic. So we are having excellent opportunities and excellent, I would say, vibrant dialogue to engage in these discussions.
I think that's a really nice point. That's something I'd like to come back to later, is this sort of motion between sort of deprivations and opportunities. But I have a question, because you used a word that I think is a really interesting, rich word. For me, it was new, and we had it in our earlier conversation, so it's not that new, but I'm actually curious. It was hidden curriculum, and I'm curious, because I think we know what it means for you, but I'm curious, Menna or Dan, what is the hidden curriculum for you?
I think it's the ritual. So I was really thinking about this from our last conversation. What is the hidden curriculum? We know what the curriculum is, the accreditation, blah, blah, blah. But what is that hidden meta structure that we don't think about? And I think it's the ritual. And I think it's really reflected in the stories on the exhibition, on the digital exhibition, and how issues like race and communication with the teachers and access to opportunities have been amalgamated with how you walk into a hallway and approach an office, how you sit in a studio, how do you graduate and get your degree and wear the silly things and all this, the ritual, and how the ritual has been almost considered as a dogma that we don't touch, and this pandemic and this situation has disturbed that kind of dogma because it cannot sustain itself anymore. So then we now have to question it, and then what does that ritual do, and what's its use, and where are the violences that are inherited in this ritual, because the university has been complicit in neoliberal and white supremacist projects for the past, I don't know how many years. So how then what is that ritual? So I've been thinking about this, and I was thinking about the hidden curriculum and the ritual, the bodily, the visceral ritual of an architecture student going in, spending the night, talking to a teacher, being late on submission, spending waking up overnight to submit the next day, getting the euphoria of your project, getting a comment that you don't understand, getting a comment that you know is racist, but nobody else is going to believe that it's racist because it did not sound racist. So to other people, I mean. So I think that is what the word hidden curriculum evoked for me, and I'm really curious to know from Dan what he thinks, and from Ashraf also what you were thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate this, because I've been also thinking about this hidden curriculum from the pre-conversation that Ashraf, you brought up, and I think the ritual is a good way to frame it. And I've noticed the biggest difference is in how students feel comfortable to push a project with agency, like and students' relationships to projects are also the students' relationships to the institution. Can you push a project? Can you go beyond the bounds? Can you disobey what the teacher says? And I feel like there's a particular attitude about agency and how power can be mobilized that is very different, very contextual. And students will, coming from all these different backgrounds, will bring their own hidden curriculums that work in certain contexts. But of course, one hidden curriculum, one strategy or one lesson from one hidden curriculum doesn't necessarily work in another, and there are kind of a lot of misunderstandings that happen. One example I remember telling my students was about the institution and like what to do and how to change things. And I said, it's difficult because you have to think of the institution as a building that's created with walls. Some walls are made out of concrete, some walls are mud, and some walls are paper, but they all look the same. And some things you push against and they're solid, Others you push against and your like hand will go right through it. It's not a real wall. It's actually just a loose paper sheet hanging down, and other walls are mud. But if you press really hard, you can make it happen. And the difficulty is knowing which is which walls, what boundaries that appear solid are not. And that negotiation of an institution in this kind of like spatial material metaphor requires the student to both like know which is what, like, oh, I know, you know, you're not supposed to stay here after, you know, whatever, like the deadline is this, but we all know that it's possible to push it, versus like, there's no budget for this actually, but if you really email like 10 times, there is, you know, you can really push this model. But then, so that requires an understanding of the landscape of which walls are what, but also it's connected to like a person's own agency, and like, are you willing to push really hard on a wall, or are you willing to lean on it, or do you feel like you can like push all your might? Who am I? Who is the student to exert that effort? Or is that rude or inconsiderate or destructive, because that might be, you know, impinging on someone's boundaries? And I feel like the negotiation between agency and boundaries and power manifests at the institutional level and manifests at the scope of the project and a pedagogical level, and they both are very connected. And I don't, you know, just to be clear, I don't think any one particular curriculum is good or better, but when there's like a contextual mismatch, without the contextual mismatch being clarified, I feel like that's where the difficulties have lied, and I've seen a lot of miscommunication happen. And I think that's, the hidden curriculum is not knowing that there's a hidden curriculum. And the hidden curriculum is not everyone not knowing that everyone doesn't know that there's a hidden curriculum, perhaps.
Okay, I just want to add one point about the hidden curriculum. If we look at it from it's like a bigger perspective, there is no one hidden curriculum, definitely. There are multiple hidden curricula that you can see in even the same year, because each tutor or instructor has their own rituals, and these rituals translate into relationships with the students, translate into spontaneous engagements. So you can find that, for example, one studio focusing, and as you say, Dan, is focusing, it has to do with the nature of the project also, not only with the nature of the institution, because certain projects change the rituals. If you're doing a community design project, for example, the type of relationships that exist in the studio environment get very, very different from a typical design studio that is focusing on modernist values, for example. So you will go to the apprentice model and the type of relationships that emanate from that model if you are focusing on a project of that nature, and you go to another one. But in all cases, as a general definition, it's about unstated values that stem tacitly from the social relations of the learning setting. Now, we have a new learning setting, which is called Zoom. Okay, so what hidden curriculum we should have? That's the point. And not necessarily we should have, but what are the rules that govern the types of relationships? There has to be some form of rules that govern these relationships. Some of them are being, actually, we are learning as when we deliver a class or a studio session, we are learning actually about the type of relationship, because when I do a studio session, physical, face-to-face, I've been doing it for 30 years. But now I started to do something last 7, 8, 10 months, and you're learning from it. You're learning how to engage with the students, how to control the when you want to control, how to leave it open for discussion when you want to leave it open for discussion. All these dynamics are really being shaped, and I would say it changed the nature of power in the studio. Because it's not the normal thing where you have to go and say, okay, students, you have the last chance to be creative, so experiment with the ideas and do whatever and all of that. No, now we have to go into some constraints and some ideas, which open also points for discussion about the idea of experience and learning from the everyday. Now, we have a pandemic condition, and we ask students, typically in a typical studio environments, go and learn from the city. You need to visit this building and this building and this building. Now, we cannot tell the student, go and learn from the city. So what is the alternative? Go and learn from what? So basically, certain components of the city should be abstracted and subjected to specific pedagogic orientation so that students can learn from. So students need to be able to learn from the city without going into the city. How do we do that? That's a challenge and opportunity also.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on all the past statements, because something that I'm hearing in each of them is this question of power, right? And I think that something that came out of the strike MoMA conversations, I think something that Fred Moten said, was around the way that an aspect of pedagogy, at least at the universities in the US, has also been this question of policing, right? And policing to a standard that everybody is coming from the same resourcing, right? This idea that everyone is kind of living a neutral middle class existence. But something that the reports and the conversations with students also revealed is how wildly different everyone's experiences can be, you know, going back to this understanding of like hidden curriculum or hidden ritual. In the conversation that we had with the students at the opening of this exhibition, a moment happened between Oromia, who's a student from Ethiopia, and Abena, who's a student from Ghana, saying, oh, hey, how did you explain power outages to your faculty, right? And them saying like, oh, I didn't want them to think that I'm just, you know, slacking off. But then all the things that you have to end up disclosing to your faculty to kind of put a dent in this understanding of the neutrality of your access to resources, things that came up during the pandemic, not just from international students, but my own students having to report their medical status to me, to report the fact that they're attending the wake of a parent, the fact that they both of their parents are in hospital in a country that they can't access. Things like this have to be reported to you in order to sort of maintain this structure of policing in your pedagogy. And I'm wondering how you approach that in educating students to a sort of standard of like neutral meritocracy, or to a standard of rigor that's loosely defined, again, a part of this hidden curriculum, loosely defined by the institution, when things like their visa relies on the work. So they are working in this more, I think, constrained way in a lot of ways, because they're trying to find the exact hidden curriculum that you're grading them to in order to maintain their visa. So I'm wondering like how that factors into the way that you approach pedagogy, and the ways that you have approached pedagogy, especially in the pandemic, when a lot of students are also facing like very real infrastructures and medical questions and death in their lives that quote unquote shouldn't have to do with their work, but is also like everything that is pressuring and influencing their work. And in a way, this sort of neutralism being a stage or a choreography, a kind of rehearsal for how to be kind of a neoliberal worker for whom your quote unquote private life never affects your ability to perform, right? So I'm curious about how you engage with that like element of policing in pedagogy that's sort of holding students to the same quote unquote standard of rigor, despite them all having these, you know, other hidden things in their lives.
Let me jump in, because it's not just the issue for my students. I had to do some of my teaching when I was in Egypt, and I had to be with my community in the south of Egypt for a while, where internet is just bad. So I know what it means to having to explain to people and how hard it is and how much of a burden it can be. And at the same time, I need to sustain. This has to do with this image. What are you supposed to be as a neoliberal worker, as you said, whether you're a teacher or a student. So what kind of identity that you have embodied and the performance that comes with it, and then how life interferes with that performance. And instead of responding to life and taking care of yourself, you are just sheltering people from your life. And how hard it was for a while that I had to tell my students that I can't be on Zoom today because my 4-year-old is throwing up, but she has a medical history, and I have to tell them all these things. And why did that feel humiliating? So why did I feel humiliated? Because my life is my life. And I'm thinking about this in this frame that you mentioned, Jess, that everybody has raised, which is the question of power. And the fact that the image, the performance is linked to how much power I can acquire. So I was thinking, if I tell them that I can't be there because I don't have access to internet, so I am not a competent teacher. And if they can't tell me that there's an outage, and because we all know that, so to me, that's my students who come from the parts of the world I come from, they know exactly what I know, what power outage means. But sometimes if they don't know, they don't want to tell me because they feel like they're losing power. So how this idea of acquiring power have been linked to the performance that we must do, not the one that's visceral and happening and ongoing. So this has been one of the biggest struggles, and I've ended up after 2 or 3 weeks and just like, screw that, and I'll just tell everybody what is happening. And we have decided that this is a spatial education experience in itself. Now our houses are our cities. Now our experiences are spatial, and this is a part of our design education. And the fact that you can't be there is something that's part of our education, and this is architecture, and this has to be thought about as it is happening and ongoing. And another thing that has to do with this point of power, kept thinking about, is how the politics of attendance, being there, participating, have been now disrupted by these politics of appearance and disappearance on Zoom. So who gets to appear and who gets to disappear? Because when we were in class, attending means I can see you. But now attending does not mean that I can see you. And I can't enforce, and that would be really me abusing my power, enforce you to turn on your camera while you're inside your house, there is your family, all these things. Maybe you don't want to let me into your space, and that's your right. And then how this politics of appearance and disappearance have changed. So being has nothing to do with appearing. And I kept thinking about that in all our discussions on race and marginality that have been often framed about, we need to see what's not seen. But most of the time, if you are thinking about an issue from the margin or from a minority, sometimes you don't want to be seen. You don't want to be subject to the gaze of power. You don't want to be subject to a white gaze. So this now within Zoom, this option of disappearance happens. And now me as a symbol of power as a teacher or whatever, I'm deprived of that right to see. And this has been such an interesting thing that I don't know what to make of it. And it's just this sticky situation that I enjoy, but also complicates things. And it's about, and somehow puts me also in other anxieties of not being able to see, not as a control, but as not being able to see my students, not as an act of control, but as a, because I need to see people as well. Just my need to see faces as a human being. So this as power is a tool of subverting power. I think this was something that was very interesting, and I'm curious of what you all think. The fact that there were so many structures of powers as the hidden curriculum, as you were talking about, Ashraf, has been already disrupted, but also other links and constraints and power dynamics were created as well. And then what does that mean when we go back to school and appearance becomes linked to attendance again?
I think it's very challenging at this point to be able to say, okay, this is how it's going to go in that direction or that direction. But I would say it's a special experience. And the point Jess was raising, and also Menna, about, okay, you are at home, but you are in public at the same time. So the public-private dialogue is happening at the same second. And sometimes you just woke up and then you go to a meeting or to an engagement session with the students and you just opened your eyes, but then you have to not use the camera and all of this. So I think these dynamics are very important and will play an important part of the future studio pedagogy. But going back to the point on how to deal with issues related to special circumstances, students are experiencing difficult situations and all of this, there is no doubt that universities have accepted in a way or another, whether explicitly or implicitly, to lower the expectations of the students last year. It did not impact necessarily the outcome of the students. If you see the online design shows of the end of year, excellent work, but definitely universities and tutors did not have the same kind of expectations that they used to have before. So they were lenient in accepting student excuses and accepting student circumstances. And typically we accept student circumstances before the pandemic, but you used to deal with it as one case, two cases out of 20. Now you're dealing with the entire class as having a special circumstance, you know? So it is challenging, but definitely expectations went lower a bit.
Yeah, I really think that's a good point to make. And I think in the lowering of those expectations, maybe there's a space for non-punitive or non-carceral logics of education. I've been thinking, and I don't have great conclusions on this, but I tried in my syllabi to have a code intention of like, when non-punitive models of, to say like, this will be a non-punitive class, you won't be punished for not doing work, but rather attempted to be supported. And I think the boundary of like, undoing some carceral logics and saying, what happens when a student doesn't do work? Why does that happen? There's a lot of reasons why that couldn't. Where is the boundary between supporting students to be rigorous through their own practice and also non-punitive modes in which it's not punishment that drives it, but a student's own internal desire to progress or grow in the ways that they wish to grow? And I think that is a really interesting, I don't think necessarily have strong conclusions, but I think it is fascinating because I think those punitive logics of education are learned deeply. Everyone who's been through like a grade school system, even the idea of grades is a kind of structure of like ascension, and that I think is linked to kind of a carceral system. So I think that's just something I've been thinking about. I don't know if I have any statements on that. Just that leniency, lowering the leniency has as a side effect created a less punitive context. Are there ways to not do that at the same time be not punitive so that this kind of slack or understanding just that you were trying to hope for could come through? And then the other thought I had is to Menna's comment on power and the camera, which I think is really funny in a way. It's just a total like, what can we do? The cameras are off, like that's what we'll work with, and like someone's having a bad day, we all have our lives. And I think there's something very frustrating and funny at the same time about it. One thing I thought in a very particular way was the question of cameras and visibility and appearance it's linked to the medium, our particular medium of Zoom, crafted by, you know, a particular company that happens to have like their choice of medium and interface, and the human-computer interaction has like drastically affected so many of us. Like what a wild, you know, their set of chosen affordances has shaped education. What a really interesting thing. And so I think thinking about the temporal tyranny of voice and video, like only one person can be speaking at a time, unfortunately. Like we can't all be talking over each other, which I wish we could. But then like anonymous Google Docs or slides as a way for students to write in text that's both asynchronous and, you know, like you can see other people typing. 12 people, 100 people can type in the same document at a time, and it's visible. And I think I think in some ways there's a role for educators to like to introduce, like there are always going to be power. I've been thinking like there will always be power dynamics or power structures within a context. There's either our choice to subject ourselves, our classes to the kind of the defaults of the power relationships, or to willingly generate new ones, as if we're in like in a play together and be like, let's try this. It's very constructed. We're all going to write something in a Google Doc for 10 minutes and go through this particularly contrived process together. But the contrivance of this is no less more or less contrived than bringing all our hidden curriculums of power to a Zoom context. Yeah, and I've wondered, and I'm curious if others have thoughts about like the role of, I guess, both learners and teachers in deliberately crafting or constructing our power relations, you know, because we can't avoid them. So how do we craft them? And yeah, actually, I guess that's a question of like, have people found ways of crafting or not crafting or deliberately altering those power relationships in our classes as to replace maybe the hidden mix of confusing ones that would otherwise rise to the fore?
What is one thing I wanted to follow up on that Menna said and really ties together all of your comments is this performing, not just reinforcing the standard, but performing to the standard as a way to gain power. This idea that it also isolates students, where they do this thing that they hide as long as possible, that they have some difficulty happening, and then it will explode right at the last deadline, right? That like everything was actually a wreck the entire time, but I thought that I could sort of gain a certain amount of power or maintain a certain amount of control by pretending that everything was performing to this standard that we agree is like the rigorous or neutral sort of meritocratic level. And at the same time, how confession is a loss of power or like a giving up of that power. Saying that you can't perform to that level means that some accommodation will be given to you, but that you'll also be regarded as a less rigorous student, also reflecting a less rigorous instructor, as you said. So I am curious, I am grateful for your comments, but also Ashraf, I feel that last year, at the end of last year, there was a lot of desire to sort of like, okay, you know, we can be a lot more flexible. But actually over the course of this year, I felt that went away. The desire to be more flexible was just like, well, they're used to it now, so everything's fine. And I often found myself kind of in conflict with different pedagogical approaches around sort of how to continue to adapt a level of flexibility at the same time as like thinking about rigor in a different way. How you can bring conversation and reading into studio, God permit, bring it into studio as well and as strongly, that crafting of argument to be as strong as that crafting of, you know, what we stereotypically think of as design.
One important thing is that part of it is also perception. So for example, we used to give students one deadline on Thursday or Friday, you're going to submit this, and this is how you're going to submit it. Okay. Now I give a range. So you have a week to present or to submit your work from this Thursday to this Thursday. it shows flexibility, but you did not compromise the deadline still. So you can still play with certain things that help students understand flexibility and get motivated that people are collaborating with them and helping them. And at the same time, not compromising the standards. So it's a balance. And I think it's going to come, as you said, with experience. Last year, we didn't have this kind of experience. This year, definitely we have it. So
I want to take this opportunity to maybe just read a comment that came in through the chat from Annie, who's watching on Zoom. I think this was relating to an earlier statement of yours, Ashraf, that students did learn from the city virtually using Google Earth, virtual tours of buildings or institutions, and even videos from their on-site studio mates or FaceTiming walkarounds. It was not a direct experience, but a more immediate one than maps and photos. So I think that relates maybe on a kind of technological level. And I was curious, I think, to continue in the same line as the conversation is going now. Like, as pedagogues yourselves, did you try to establish any particular rituals, any new kind of norms at this opportunity of this massive change? Either in that first year, the sort of more open year, or the second, maybe more frustrated one?
For me, this has hit in spring semester 2019. And after that, I knew that my only hope to have a substantial learning experience is to adjust my ILOs, intended learning outcomes. This very rigid conception that comes with accreditation and blah, blah, blah. But I think, but the issue for me was thinking about quality being high or low versus quality being wide or narrow. So for example, we go into studio and a student has passed my studio without submitting a single drawing. And I go back to the intended learning outcomes. Out of the studio, and this is a 5th year architecture student, I know she can draw, but her family is in India. We all know what is happening there. So it's time to submit. Let's have a discussion. My intended learning outcomes out of this topic were this, and that, and they were all about a political project. What do you need out of this? What do we need out of this topic? And we have a discussion. And out of the discussion, I think the student has met the intended learning outcomes. And to me, that passes the studio. And I don't think of that as lowering my quality, because I don't gain or something, or I don't think there is less quality in speaking architecture than drawing architecture. And because architecture was written and spoken in some context. So the entirety of Mamluk Cairo was written on paper and it was not drawn. And the fact that you write architecture has expanded language. So the fact that architecture has came in so many different mediums than the ones we dogmatically instate in our studio does not mean that we have not produced architecture and we have not dealt rigorously with a political project. So the fact that I set the intended learning outcomes, and instead of lowering and hiring the quality, I just widen the scope of. And this is what I agreed to with myself. I have A, B, C, D. These are the things that we need to get out of this. They all have to do with thought and learning and experiences and things about a certain topic. Have you engaged with that? Did you care for a while? And if you couldn't care for a while because there are things that are more important, that's okay too. And then we move along. So this has been one of the strategies that made me at least feel like I have not given up rigor, but somehow has widened the scope of it in a studio. So this is just an empirical, anecdotal things that I have tried within studio within the pandemic. And I also have to say that when universities opened for 4 students at a time, it was very important for them to attend, but then a studio is bigger than 4 students. And then I had exercises in which they go and build a model 4 people at a time in the same model, and then we end up having 16 people building the same model without having being together in the same time, the model does not represent any kind of architecture. This is not going to be a building anytime soon, and I don't think any teacher of architecture will qualify that and qualify me as a teacher. But to me, I think that's a spatial art practice, and the spatial practice of architecture itself is a part of us teaching architecture. So these have been the I would say tactics that I have tried to, strategies and tactics that I have tried to apply during this time. And let's see what happens. And then next year, I'm both anxious and excited.
Just to add one point regarding the question that was raised, which is really important. Yes, students have learned from digital platforms, Google Earth, and all of these experiences. And I'm not saying they are not good tools. They are, definitely, but they are insufficient. Why? Because the dimension of people is not there. So when you experience a walkthrough virtually, a building, still you're going to talk about the physical environment and the characteristics of the space, the spirituality of the space, and all of these good things. But still you have not experienced it where people are in, where you experience reality, basically. And that's the difference between experiential learning and other forms of learning. Experiential learning is about engaging with reality. And the reality is the city, is the actual city. Yes, we can simulate these realities, but still you haven't used all of your senses in understanding these realities. You don't smell the space by doing it virtually. You don't touch the space and understand the texture by doing it virtually. So it's an insufficient experience. It's good, and but it's not a replacement for the actual experience. So
yeah, I agree with that. And maybe to like reply to Lev, your question was one of the structures that my co-teachers and I tried to do in a drawing class this semester was to create the collaborations between students, where, you know, to replace what the natural environment of a studio environment where, you know, there's a lot of multiplicity of like side conversations between students, to ask students to interrogate and ask questions about each other's personal life environments, so that what they're interfacing in, what they're discussing are, so that the goal, the designs or the drawings that they're creating or spaces that are analyzing are the ones that they have the most lived experience in. If being separately means that there's not a lot of shared lived experience around a studio that then can help do these tours, there's at least a personal lived experience of each own person's you know, neighborhood or abstracted living environment that could then be communicated with another person. So I feel like a lot of the strategies of these powers of pedagogy I've tried, and I think we could try to come down to like relational exercises or ways in which people communicate with each other to try to think about the spatial practices. I think Menna, you said something about this. We're already in while using Zoom, and like Ashraf said, that are about the people, you know, about the other student who is in the other room, another place, and the spatial systems of their environment, of their desk, of their home, of the neighborhood, and how those specifically intersect. And that way, the design is not kind of a something out there in the future to be designed pavilion while we sit here, you know, with a camera off in a very, you know, in a much more complex environment, because our homes and our work and all, you know, are kind of like spatial environment. As our spatial environments have shrunk to kind of like all the energy that we would normally have in space gets captured within our home environments, there's kind of a one-to-one relationship between what students are asked to study and what students are experiencing. And maybe it's like that mapping that's helpful and interesting. On a very specific level, I will really say like collaborative Google Docs and Google Slides that are anonymous, where anyone can type is a really, really interesting way to also flatten some hierarchies. I've actually had a class where we turned off the camera and audio on Zoom and then just typed in a Google Doc as a way of discussion or a chat. And the conversations you can have there are very interesting because students feel much more freer to just say, you know, a few words very quick. And so I think those kinds of plays with power, of removing power, or, you know, I think are pretty crucial, interesting.
I think that's great. And hopefully this isn't repeating anything, but I wanted to ask you, sort of come back to this point that was raised at the beginning of how do we hold on to the clarity of some of the things we've seen in the last years, some of the precarity, some of the anxieties, but also some of the opportunities, and the sort of cracking open of certain things that are otherwise maybe taken for granted, depending entirely on who you are. And for me, this is really becoming apparent now because I feel like there's a rush to kind of normality. And I was just reading this Paul Preciado does a series for Libération, and he has this one essay the title is like Entrée, courez, so it's like return, running, run. And he ends with this very strong kind of call, sort of like don't return, don't run, sort of this is a moment to stop and reflect. And I feel like it's a very difficult proposition because not only are our institutions are kind of, especially universities, are sort of desperate for various reasons to return to sort of normality. It made sense for them financially, it made sense for them in many ways. So I'm just curious for you three, or also you, Jess, in your capacity as a teacher, how do you resist this, or is it worth resisting, or sort of like how do you look at this, I don't know, steamship kind of rolling towards you and say, no, I don't want to go back exactly to what was before?
Okay, it's a very challenging question too, I would say, but two important things. What we are experiencing now, I would see it as operational mode. We are responding to an emergency at the moment. Even this year, not only last year, still we are treating it as an emergency. And I think we need to move beyond this idea of emergency and from the operational mode to an aspirational mode. We need to start to think of how architecture education, design education is going to look like after 3, 4, 5 years. What's going to happen? Is it blended learning, or is it a new way of doing things? That's one level. The other level is about even institutions are thinking operationally. In many institutions, they are thinking operationally, meaning, okay, they are fighting the challenge by doing what they used to do before the challenge. So as if everything is going to go back to normal. And I doubt that everything is going to go back to normal. One important person, theorist, wrote in 80s, Donald Schoen. Everybody knows Donald Schoen, who wrote a lot about design education, design pedagogy, and he was an architect, systems engineer, management expert, and all of this. And he talked about beyond the stable state, that the idea of we will not have a stable state again. And that's before the pandemic. And the pandemic is even emphasizing that. So there will be no stable state. We're not going to a state where it's going to continue forever as we used to imagine. No, it's going to be changing and fluctuating all the time. And we need to prepare ourselves for that. I think we need to have an adaptive system at the individual level and at the institutional level, that you can cope with circumstances very quickly, that you can go from online, yes, exactly, Donald Schoen, beyond the stable state, that we can go from that online to physical, back to online, all of these. Because what? Now everybody is saying that the pandemic is going to be an annual event. Okay, so what we're going to do if this is going to be an annual event? So it's like the influenza, the flu season. So what's going to happen with that? So imagine if you have 3-4 months in the year, you have to be in lockdown, and then the rest of the year you are out with people. So I think this kind of flexibility and this kind of adaptability is really important at all levels: students, staff, and teachers, and institutions.
I think for me too, you know, thinking about, it's difficult to think about what to resist in the future when I think the university themselves is not exactly sure what they're trying to do. I think a lot of the mandates that at least I've seen so far from my institution have been like a series of if-then statements where, you know, all of a sudden university administration have to turn into like public health oracles, like trying to imagine or predict, you know, what the future of this pandemic will be. And then also, I think it's been really important to resist saying that the pandemic is over. I think there's been a lot of like rush to be like, oh, it's over, which is impossible to say when I'm in class with students who have family in India, who have family in Ethiopia and Ghana and all of these places that are not experiencing it in the same way that the Northeast of the United States is experiencing it. So again, that question of resistance for me has been like a resistance of certainty in a lot of ways, of just saying like, honestly, I do not know what the fall is going to look like. And just saying that, you know, for myself and for students who are asking me, it's like, it could look a number of different ways. I could give you a list of like if-then statements, but I think it's more useful to you to say that it's uncertain. It's not clear.
I would say, I agree with Ashraf and Jess, and I don't think this is over. But something that I would like to take into the future, if I go back into class or stay on Zoom, is cats. I would like people to, not just the cats and dogs and sisters and cousins and the 800 people in one family that I'm really familiar with, and the favorite plants behind you, this kind of flora and fauna coming into studio through Zoom. And with it comes all these visceral poetics, that the cat that comes in and hugs you, and suddenly the body language of a student changes entirely. And I would like to encourage everybody to bring their cats to class. I know it's gonna smell, life smells, that's okay. Just start, maybe it's a chance to challenge that public-private dichotomy and the clear line that just comes with Western perceptions of space, that there is a public space and a private space, and then it's a construction to protect property rights, basically. So cats, yes, this is what I would like to go forward with.
Go on the top.
Yeah, I think the kind of related to the cats is like the sometimes informality of admitting that our lives like enter into the grid. I think that's a really valuable and important thing, especially in the early pandemic. I remember this like last March, April, May, wherever people were, there was a good February, you know, there's a great deal of kind of, how are you doing opening up the kind of informality of the world entering in, which I think is difficult to do because it directly competes with the need for power and legitimacy that the institution, like that the teacher has to work with or not work with. But I think that kind of informality, I would really love to continue, wish we could all continue with it. And I guess the experimentation with mediums, the question of affordances, of like visibility of cameras, I feel like these are all actually quite fascinating things that there's been a worldwide research experiment on the affordances of communication and how we do this. And yeah, I think maintaining those aspects, and I've already seen a lot of new quasi institutions start up and many collaborations personally and by others with people who are like, oh yes, I forgot that I've never seen these people before, but I've been working with them for a year, you know. And so maybe in the aftermath of an unstable state or even an unstable institution, or maybe even new institutions that, you know, have a Zoom room or have other mediums with affordances that can support kinds of learning that are not possible or not easily doable or maybe even desirable in the institutions that we know. Maybe even the idea of an international student won't exist anymore.
Yeah. I just want to add one point to this. Now, for example, first-year master students in most British universities were allowed not to come at all and start their education from where they are. So they don't have to come entirely, okay? So, and as you say, that idea of international student might end up vanishing because you will be able to have some form of degree or learn in any environment virtually and digitally. So I think it has a lot of positives, what we are talking about, because now knowledge is distributed, is not owned by anyone. Okay, it is going to be available everywhere. In the past or before the pandemic, you used to say, okay, in any discussion in the third world or in the non-Western world, the discussion starts from what's happening in the Western world, okay? So when you go to Korea, when you go to Egypt, when you go to Africa, when people are discussing things about design and architecture or whatever, they start from Frangeri. They don't start from the immediate environment that they have and what is good about it and what is bad about it. So I think the pandemic really will redefine the nature of knowledge in architecture. The circles of magazines that you see now, the certified magazines of Architecture Review, Architecture Record, and all of these will be part of the formula, but will not be the formula as it is now, you know.
I have two quick comments. One is like a shout out to, again, the collaborators that the three of us designed the website, Lucy Xiao Liu and Shay Fitzpatrick. And when we were thinking of the exhibition as kind of a landscape, we were thinking of it as an abstracted landscape, not necessarily like deliberately not correlated to geography. I think that was in conversation with you and Jess and Lev, but so that each person was going through a terrain, exploring a movement. So each person's story is a movement between spaces. And I feel like maybe as a metaphor, that's that connects to something Ashraf you just said about, you know, everyone's in their own space, moving, has their own kinds of knowledge and education to be valued. I just wanted to shout out that, like, I feel like we did think a lot about, you know, the primacy of like a central location and how to like not work with that and supporting students' stories. And so I wanted to shout out Lucy and Shay. And the other comment is kind of a joke, but if you know, it strikes me that if a like a non-human alien came from a different planet and came to a university, and it's like, wow, so interesting. You have 13 people gathered in a room. There's one person, and there's all these people come from different parts of the earth to gather here. How enriched must that first person must be? I'm sure the alien would be surprised to think, oh, what? It turns out actually that person is supposed to tell everyone what to do. Interesting. One would think that if everyone is gathering to one place, that person is learning so much from everyone. How is it that the supposed distribution of knowledge is the other way around? That is so interesting. And I think that as a thought experiment, that's an interesting way to think about why we're not learning from, like, why the student relationship, why is the student, why is the immense resources and like abundance that comes into the space not celebrated, as, you know, and the teacher almost seen, that one person seen as a recipient of an incredible amount of abundance.
That's a really beautiful image. And also, I don't know, Jess, how you feel, but for me, a kind of like unexpected but totally convincing summary of the project. I mean, that's what the website contains in a fraction, really. thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the site, talking with us, and for today as well. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I've learned so much through this process and just through this conversation. I'm incredibly grateful to have been able to do this over the course of this year. So thank you, Menna, and thank you, Ashraf, and especially thank you, Dan, for being with us through the entire production of this piece as one of the many disembodied collaborations of the year. So yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.